Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet on which a pandemic, vac- on which there's still COVID running around. Anyone who's been in transit lately knows that reality. It's a planet that's disrupted by still by the turbulence from Putin's war, and now there's a war in the Middle East erupting, which is a unbelievable circumstance that will be playing out and in the foreground for months, if not years to come. And my best wishes go out to those whose families have been affected. In my case, it's a direct impact. One impact avoided. I had a son who was actually he was in the Israeli Defense Force briefly. Long story there for another webcast. And today we're going to talk about energy and climate with Alex Epstein, who has made this his life's work, really, this last decade, almost a decade. You've been working longer than that
It's
on
been
issues.
16 years I've been on this issue.
Yeah, I know. And you started with a wider lens, looking at the role of regulation and the role of freedom and freedom to pursue a better life and work at the Cato Institute and Rand and onward. But you have two books that you've done: The Moral Case for
Just
Fossil.
FYI, sorry, but I never worked at Cato. I just had an adjunct there, just in case people
Okay.
fact check me and say I claimed I worked at Cato.
Okay. Um, well, let's get right into it. The
Yeah.
key here is what to think and to do about climate and energy, and how much we need to base what we do now and going forward on how the world has powered itself in the past centuries, and what the role of innovation is, what the role of regulation is, what the role of where you direct your finance and your interests going forward is an arena in great flux, as I've been writing about since 1988, since this issue really became a front page issue. I'm pleased to do this conversation today. Those in the audience will have a chance to, obviously, to post questions on the platform you're watching on, and please do share this with others. And you can also join us in the studio after about a half hour. I'll post a link where you can kind of come into the green room, and if you do so with civility and have some questions, you can actually talk to Alex directly. The new book, I find lots of things in here to embrace. I've been writing about climate change for decades. I've also been writing about vulnerabilities for decades, meaning social vulnerabilities, and where and how people can build better lives. Energy, absolutely, is a fundamental reality for humans, for all life on Earth. And one of the definitions of life is harnessing energy and putting it to work. So, Alex, and this idea that one of the core ideas in your new book is about sort of a formula that puts human flourishing in the foreground and building energy policies and the like around that. I'm totally into that.
Good.
Well, differences that we'll get into shortly. So tell us a little bit, just quickly, what makes this the issue you wake up with and go to sleep with?
Well, it's definitely not the issue I expected to wake up with and go to sleep with. So my background is I was a math science kid from Chevy Chase, Maryland, and that's a pretty liberal area with conventional stuff. And so growing up, I never thought about any real benefits of fossil fuels. I was pretty afraid of climate catastrophe. I mean, I was in one of the top math science high schools in the country, and I remember teachers talking about that, and that seemed scary. And it really didn't even make sense to me why we were still using fossil fuels, because I love technology and I love things to evolve. So I figured, well, why don't we just use solar? Why don't we just use nuclear? The latter, for reasons we can get into, I think is much more plausible. But yeah, so I never thought this would be my issue. I think what led me to it is a couple of things. One is realizing when I was 27 that energy is the industry that powers every other industry, which I, despite going to Duke and supposedly having a good education, never really realized. And if energy is the industry that powers every other industry, the cost of energy and the reliability of energy, that determines everything. Because the lower cost, more reliable energy is, the lower cost and more reliable everything is, the higher cost and less reliable energy is, the higher cost and less reliable everything is. And I was fortunate enough, I was just doing a random project on Rockefeller. And it was fascinating to me to learn the history of the industry leading up to him, because I had always thought, oh, we just used whale oil and then we replaced it with oil. And why are we using oil so much? But I learned that there were actually half a dozen competitors at the time, including many, quote, renewables, like the equivalent of ethanol. But none of them could make the countryside light because they weren't cost effective. They weren't sufficiently affordable and reliable and scalable for a typical poor person on the countryside to have light. And then oil came on the scene, and it was so cost effective that within 5 years, people were talking about the countryside lighting up. And it just made this impression, wow, it's not just enough to have energy technology. We need cost-effective energy. And it occurred to me, maybe the reason we're still using fossil fuels is because still in some ways, that's a uniquely cost-effective form of energy. And I quickly started concluding this was true, looking at things like agriculture, where we use diesel to power the machines that allow us to feed 8 billion people, and with natural gas, where we provide the fertilizer. And it struck me that I'm only hearing negatives about fossil fuels, not positives. And this is just a huge thinking error. And my real background is philosophy. And just if we're not really thinking about the full positives of fossil fuels and we're just looking at the negatives, we're going to make bad decisions. So that was the kernel that made me want to look into the issue for myself. And that was 16 years ago. And then I ended up concluding that fossil fuels had way more benefits than I thought, including, interestingly, climate-related benefits.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll talk about air conditioning, among other things. Meaning, how do you reduce your vulnerability to climate extremes? I wanted to do something just fun here, just to start off in a fun way. Talk about my priors. This is one of these words that comes out of Bayesian thinking. What is your predisposition and your inherent bias, and how do you work with that or overcome it? And I'm going to play a song that I wrote, and you'll get the reason why it's relevant.
Yeah, this has never happened in an interview, so
I'm sure it hasn't.
It's distinctive.
Yeah, I wrote this song a long time ago. It was around, 20 years ago. I'm a songwriter on the side. And I have to switch screens to do this. So excuse the technical stuff. But you'll see why it's relevant in a second. I'm not going to play the whole song, but you'll get the idea.
It took 1,000 generations for our species to rise, but gathering and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. Then someone came along and said, hey, try lighting this. He opened up the ground and showed us coal and oil. Said, come liberate some carbon, it'll make your blood boil. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe. It's the American way. Now I got peat swamp fossils running my TV.
So is that you singing?
Yeah.
When did you do this song?
Oh, I wrote it a long time ago, and I performed it offline. Here, I'm going to switch over to actually. Let me just stop it. You get the idea.
Yeah. So what do we learn about you from that? I have some ideas.
Here's the deal. If you read the lyrics, I want to show the lyrics so you get the idea. When I first wrote it, which I think was around 2003, when the invasion of Iraq was happening, the questions about how much of that was a function of the need for oil, the need for security. But here are the lyrics, right? So the what you just heard was then someone came along and said, "Hey, try lighting this." But when I first wrote it, the first versions of it, it was then Satan came along and said, "Hey, try lighten this."
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a different feel.
Yeah, and actually it was a conservative blogger who first noticed that in the early versions, and I thought about this, because a lot of my reporting on energy poverty and the like really forced me to reckon with that fairly simplistic way of thinking about this. So that's the key. And then I did update the lyric, and this is all public. I blogged about it and like.
Mhm.
So it went from someone Satan to someone, and I think that says a lot about how it's good to sort of step back from our own instincts and starting points. And I thought it would be really cool to frame this conversation around something you make an important point in one of your many YouTube channels about a magic question for in your case for winning fossil fuel arguments is, let's look at the pros and cons, meaning stepping back from really trying to kind of set aside, well, what do you think, what do you mean when you say that? What's the value of that kind of question?
So I don't remember that video is a number of years ago, so I don't remember exactly what I said there. But the basic idea is, I'm putting it here as winning fossil fuel arguments. I think because the audience was a sympathetic audience, and so they're
Sure.
thinking of it that way. But I would say more broadly, it's just a way for winning in your thinking and in your conversation, which is to frame the conversation in a way that you think is logical, where hopefully you can get some common ground. And so I think there are a number of ideas that you can do that with, but the one I use the most is the idea, you can call it pros and cons. I often call it carefully weighing benefits and side effects. So when you
Right.
think of something like, burning fossil fuels has negative climate side effects, which I agree with. So if it's, it's going to cause more heat waves and cause a sea level rise, and all things being equal, you don't want a lot of sea level rise. And so the idea is, when you're thinking about something like that, you need to carefully weigh benefits and side effects. And there, with fossil fuels, there are three elements of it. Just so there's what are the broad benefits of fossil fuels, of continuing fossil fuel use that we won't get if we rapidly eliminate fossil fuels and kind of the popular 2050 timetable. So as the broad benefits, there are also what I call the climate mastery benefits, which I think is the most avoided or evaded issue, which is, how do fossil fuels allow us to be extremely resilient in ways such that even if they cause climate problems, they can more than solve them. They can actually overwhelm any problems. So we could talk about that. And the other thing is actually considering, are there any positive climate side effects? So are there benefits of greening, and are there benefits of warming, particularly in colder places? And what I find is that nobody really disagrees with this methodology of carefully weighing benefits and side effects. So that's why I think it's winning for my position, because my position is based on thinking about it this way. And I do think if people think about it this way, they're going to at least move a lot closer to my position than, let's get rid of essentially all fossil fuel use in the next 27 years, which I don't think is a tenable position if you're actually carefully weighing the benefits and side effects.
For sure. And this is something that we agree on. I think, what I try to do in my writing and my webcasts is to find points of agreement and to strip back to some basic principles of what actually is the question.
Mhm.
And like when you say climate emergency, I don't mean you, but when someone says climate emergency, my first question is, who's in a state of emergency? And then if you carefully look at the data, well, it's people who are marginalized or living in a floodplain, or who built a wood home in a combustible fire zone in the Rockies. And then you say, okay, what drove that impacts? And that's when climate change quickly recedes actually into the background, along with building codes, sprawl into areas that are fundamentally subject to fire,
Mhm.
for flooding, for marginalized low income people, the lack of air conditioning, as you've argued, as Destiny Knock at Carnegie Mellon. She's done this study. She's a social scientist who works on energy poverty, and she has shown. She was on my show a year or so ago. She's worked in Africa too, and she has shown that in Pennsylvania, some neighborhoods that she was focusing on, people who have low incomes and air conditioning wait 4 to 7 degrees of heating before they turn their air conditioner on.
Mm.
And to me, that's a crystallization of a point that you make that I absolutely endorse, which is that lack of affordable energy can really be dangerous. In that case, she's shown this through data. It's really good work. And she's also done similar work on cold and, poorly insulated homes. And you get into all these issues. If you think it's just a fossil fuel problem, though, then you're missing the housing aspect. Who owns the house that the low income person might be in? Who has the control over whether it's well insulated or not? If you're a renter, you can't weatherize your house, right? So you have these social factors that can be much more dimensional than just about the price of fossil fuels that also contribute to these problems.
Let me just say so you raised this, I liked how you raised this issue of emergency and who is the emergency for. I just want to raise two other quick issues, and we can go in depth on them or not. But one, which I talk a lot about in Fossil Future, is by what standard are you calling something an emergency? I think among people who think about this issue, there are quite a few people who think of an emergency. The core thing of an emergency is just that we're impacting things a lot. There's a view that it's wrong to impact the earth. And so if we've impacted the earth a lot, that on its face is an emergency, even if it's not an emergency for us. And my argument is, well, if you look at things like climate disaster deaths going way down, we don't currently have an emergency from a human perspective. And in fact, we're better off in terms of climate livability than we used to be.
Sure.
But I think that it's important to know what's your standard, because if your standard is impact is bad, we want to eliminate it, that's different from your standard is what I would say my standard is, which is human flourishing, which is the world is a place where humans have maximum opportunity to live long, healthy, fulfilling lives. And I bring up the current state of climate livability because it doesn't involve speculation nearly as much, and it I think helps us differentiate. Hey, is somebody saying it's an emergency because they think it's just because we've impacted a lot, or because it's actually bad for us? And for me, I don't have, this is part of my philosophical background, I consider myself a pro-human environmental philosopher. I like human impact in general on nature. I just think it should be intelligent. So I don't think of us as in a climate emergency, and I don't think you can defend that by a human standard, versus if somebody says, yeah, I acknowledge we're safer from climate than ever, but I predict that it's going to get a lot worse, then I at least know, okay, we're probably on the same standard, but we have different evaluations of cause and effect going forward. But if they say it's a climate emergency now, I think they don't, we're not on the same standard. The other thing is, there's a question whenever you're thinking about something that is the top issue, and in a sense, climate is the top issue, I find it very valuable to step back and ask, well, is this really the top issue given what my standard is of concern? And when it's the earth and the world as a whole, it's human flourishing. And you mentioned, well, there are things like air conditioning. And I think more broadly, if you step back and you just ask what matters most to people, there's just the strongest argument that what matters most is just poverty. And most people are really, really poor. And that goes totally with being energy poor, with having very little energy. I talk about, Robert Bryce first publicized this stat, 3 billion people using less electricity than a typical American refrigerator. I think if you step back and you look at the world, it's just people are incredibly poor. And that's the emergency. Because if we woke up the way that 5 billion people wake up, we would think it was the apocalypse. And so when I look at the world, I think of it from, there's in a sense, a perpetual poverty emergency by my standards. And I think of, and that makes people vulnerable in every way. And I think of climate in that context. I try not to just make climate the top issue because it's everyone else's top issue. It's an aspect of things, but it's not the biggest thing in my mind.
Yeah, that gets it to another issue we agree on, which is how folks in the media and leadership can get captured by a narrative. They're so focused on sort of pursuing the narrative that they subsume these other issues. When Pakistan's extreme flood happened, I wrote in pushing back on this idea, it's climate change. for several reasons, one of which is that the vulnerability that's been created in those regions is enormous through just population growth in areas of fundamental flooding, and the complexities of climate make it really tough to make the case that climate change is the thing to put in the headline. The media tend to latch on to public figures, or in that case, leadership of Pakistan, who made the point. And it's hard for the media then to step back and say, well, how do we double check this at this in a real time way? And why would a public figure be pointing to climate change? And then there you have the dynamic created by the treaty, which is loss and damage, and all this expectation that the rich countries are going to compensate poor countries for anything that can be blamed on climate change. So again, there I get you. One thing I see in your book, the new book, and in your rhetoric generally, that I wonder about is why the focus on carbon-containing fuels when energy services actually are the thing that creates flourishing. So I know absolutely fossil fuels have gotten to us to where we are.
Right.
But this is your new book is about bringing your argument forward.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So you just have to be, what I call cost-effective energy. That's the key abstraction. I mean, that's the key phenomenon. It doesn't matter to me, and it should, on principle, it doesn't matter to me how you do it. I mean, except that I want it to be, I talk about the attributes of cost-effective energy. So affordability, how much can a typical person afford? Reliability, is it available when we need it in the quantity we need it? Versatility, can it power every type of machine, including difficult to power machines like airplanes and cargo ships? And then scalability, can it do that for billions of people in thousands of places? And then all things being equal, you want fewer negative side effects. So you can talk about cleanliness or safety or that kind of axis. And any sane person wants the most cost-effective and safe thing possible. And I certainly didn't get into fossil fuels just because I had a fetish for carbon energy or something like this. But what you have to recognize is that at any given time in history, for physical reasons and for economic reasons and sometimes historical reasons, certain forms of energy vastly differ in their cost effectiveness. And I think we're at a point in time still where fossil fuels are uniquely able to provide affordable, reliable, versatile, and scalable energy. And I think it's evidenced by the fact that we've had 100 years of competition. They're still 80% of the world's energy. They're still growing. And in particular, they're growing in the parts of the world that care most about cost-effective energy, which is not, unfortunately, where I live, California, where we don't care all that much. But China, which has 300 new coal plants in the pipeline designed to last 40 plus years. So I think we need to take seriously, I talk about this in chapter 5 and chapter 6, I really address, is there actually something special about fossil fuels? Because if there isn't, then you should just use something that has fewer side effects or fewer negative side effects. But I conclude that no, they're going to be uniquely cost effective for the foreseeable future for the people who have energy now to a certain extent, but especially when you consider the whole world as energy starved. So if you think of it as, well, the world needs 2 or 3 or 4 times more energy as quickly as possible, then the idea of getting rid of fossil fuels, which right now are uniquely cost effective, I think becomes deeply and murderously harmful to humanity. So if you look at my work and what I advocate as policy in chapter 10 of the book and in my work, which I work a lot with elected officials, I'm for energy freedom. So I'm trying to unleash the potential of all forms of energy. I'm arguably doing more than anyone right now. I mean, people won't see it yet, but hopefully they'll see it soon, to unleash the potential of nuclear energy and to make the policy changes there. I'm trying to do things to help geothermal. And I'm even trying to do things to help solar and wind if they actually, to create real electricity markets, which we could talk about. So I'm for all of these things, but it's the fact that cost-effective energy in general, in abstraction, is what we want, doesn't change the fact to me that for the foreseeable future, the particular industry of fossil fuels is necessary to provide cost-effective energy for what we use today, a substantial amount of that, and what's needed going forward. And this is why when people portray me as, oh, you want to use fossil fuels forever, blah, 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 that's not at all true. My argument is taking place in a point in time where and looking forward to near-term points in time, because we're talking about the next 30 years with policy, where fossil fuels are and will remain uniquely cost-effective. So that's the only reason why, because I think the facts say that if you want cost-effective energy for billions of people, you need a whole lot of fossil fuel for the next several decades. And if you rapidly eliminate it, then you're going to have global energy scarcity and all the poverty and death that goes with it.
And how does that relate to the criticisms you've made about some of the policies and subsidies and the like that have been trying to jumpstart some of the alternatives that you just mentioned, whether it's the small modular reactors or solar, or expanding a market for heat pumps so that they're more affordable for the lower income folks here in Maine, where I am, who wouldn't normally be able to get them. And once they have them, realize you're building a market for something that actually is a way to get more use out of your oil and gas and the other things feeding into your grid, because you're using a lot less energy to get the same service. So why are you so eager to jump on those other alternatives that can be part of that picture you're talking about going forward?
Well, I think there are two. So in general, I want to see the emergence of cost-effective alternatives as quickly as possible. Most of all, because I think the world needs more energy. That's the number one thing, is I just think of the world as really poor and really energy poor. And those are my core lenses. I mean, it's based on having a human flourishing lens, but that's when I think of things, that's what I think of most. So from that perspective, for example, I think nuclear, for reasons we could go into, has the most theoretical potential to equal and eventually surpass fossil fuel energy. There's certain physical fundamentals of it that are just very exciting that nothing else has. So I want that to happen as quickly as possible. What I see most of the policy, though, is most of the policy has two elements to it. It's restricting fossil fuel use now, which I think is quite harmful. I mean, I think it's very harmful. And then subsidizing, mandating, or giving other preferences to things that are not cost effective. But it's not doing it primarily on a research level, which we could talk about. That has hazards as well. But it's one thing to say on a research level, hey, we're going to expedite the development of this technology and this. But when you're actually subsidizing something that's non-economic, or preferring it, or messing up electricity markets to not account for the cost of the unreliability of solar and wind, and that plus the restriction of fossil fuels, any nation that does that is increasing the cost of its energy and threatening the reliability of its energy in a way that is not scaling globally. Because to scale globally, you need truly cost competitive alternatives. And so I mentioned China. They're building a lot more coal because that's the most cost effective thing. So insofar as you're interested in alternatives for reasons of CO2 emissions, the number one thing has to be, how do you get them to be globally cost competitive as soon as possible? And doing things that will make our country worse off is not going to accomplish that, and is very harmful to us. And I think if you look at what's happening with us vis-a-vis China, there's a lot of things there. So I want to set up things, even if you take solar and wind, I want to set up electricity markets so that everyone really has to provide reliable electricity. And then if people like Elon and others can provide truly what they would call firm solar or wind, or combine it with batteries and gas, then that's great. And again, I'm doing work to make that happen, but I'm all just focused on how do you have truly cost competitive alternatives. I think that's, as Steve Jobs would say, the high order bit. And we're contradicting that with our policy. But I'm not again, like heat pumps you mentioned. I mean, when heat pumps are cost effective, then that's great. I don't think I've ever criticized heat pumps.
But that's good to know. I mean, but you have criticized the IRA, the inflation.
Oh, well, yeah, for sure. I criticized the IRA. I could also criticize it on carbon capture. grounds, which I've done.
We could talk about that. Yeah,
but
we could do a whole
particularly,
session on
but
carbon
particularly recently. So let's take the IRA just for a second, because
Sure.
if you take the nuclear thing, there was this seeming progress in at least, well, nuclear is getting some subsidy, which it didn't previously under the production tax credit, which is focused on wind, and then the investment tax credit focused on solar. And so nuclear gets some subsidy, not as much as solar and wind, but nothing has been done to change I regard as the criminalization regime of nuclear, where nuclear is just almost impossibly expensive because it's falsely treated as a uniquely dangerous form of energy that requires infinite delay. So my focus on nuclear, to give you a different kind of focus, is let's figure out how to radically reform the NRC. And this is something I'm actively working on behind the scenes. Let's change in particular, the provisions that are incredibly damaging and pseudoscientific. And let's set up an environment where nuclear can really compete. Because if it can't compete, then it's just a vanity thing to just, we're going to subsidize it, because it's not going to scale. So I mean, I have a lot to say about the IRA, and if people want to, they can go to energytalkingpoints.com and see. I have a lot of specific stuff to say about the IRA, but it's an example of the IRA and kind of the Biden administration. It's not just Democrats, also Republicans often do this. It's kind of it's like a criminalized, at least for nuclear, but it's like a heavily restrict energy development, including like mining for solar and wind. It's like heavily restrict energy development and then subsidize energy, versus mine is no, liberate energy development and don't have subsidies, because that's what's going to get you things that are cost effective at scale. And you just take like Biden saying, hey, we're going to support all this domestic industry. And then you have this amazing mining property in Minnesota, and they say, oh no, you can't access it for 20 years. That to me is a microcosm of the insanity of being anti-development, so that it's incredibly expensive to produce energy here, and then subsidizing it and then calling that American energy. That's just an American embarrassment.
Yeah, there's so many. We could do a whole session on each one of these things. So nuclear, for sure, nuclear policy. So far, I mean, with nuclear, there is this, in New York State, for example, Cuomo had this some nukes policy, I called it, where he politically decided that Indian Point, which I lived next to for 30 years, had to shut down for his liberal New York political reasons. But the upstate nuclear plants have been maintained with a subsidy, basically. And to me, for those friends of mine who are stridently anti-nuclear, who don't think that should be part of the mix going forward, if you care about climate, you could look at that investment in maintaining those existing nuclear power plants longer as there's a carbon benefit to that. So everyone talks about a carbon price. Well, you're actually, I think it came out, someone told me it would be about $10 a ton is what you're getting by maintaining those plants going longer. So it feels like a bargain compared to some of the other.
$85 a ton the IRA gives you to put CO2 in the ground. But also with the nuclear, that calculation is probably accurate. I think the most interesting thing, though, is just think about nuclear technology. When you have an operational plant and you have very low fuel cost because the fuel is so energy dense, and you've already built the thing and paid it off, presumably, just if you know what Elon would call like first principles thinking, it should be really cheap to do that and should be very competitive to do that. And if it's not, you should look at what is preventing that, not just assume, it needs to be subsidized. I think two big categories are what are the very onerous NRC things going on that add cost. But then also there's the issue of the grid policies and solar and wind getting subsidies and solar and wind getting no price penalty for unreliability, such that the grid it totally disadvantages something like a nuclear plant, which can produce cheap electricity, at least once it's built, but it produces it at a very constant level. So if you have something that's allowed to come on anytime, like solar and wind, anytime they come on, they're given preference because they have zero marginal cost, plus they get a subsidy. Well, then you're totally digging into nuclear's revenue stream, and yet you still need the nuclear for reliability. So you're sort of bankrupting the nuclear plant based on these unfair pricing policies. And I think that's that's a case where that should be reformed. And unfortunately, IRA didn't do anything. I mean, it subsidized nuclear a little bit, but it didn't do anything to deal with the unfair pricing policies. Whereas my view is, if somebody can actually figure out, and it's plausible to me they can, to use like large amounts of solar and wind and some batteries and some gas in particular, like if you can do that in a way that can actually just deliver firm capacity, so you're not then, and you can compete with others meeting certain technology neutral reliability standards, I think that's great. But that's not the way it works right now. Right now, we just allow people to sell unreliable electricity to the grid, and then it's up to the grid operators and the public service commissions to say that's okay. And I think we've seen that planning has worked very poorly because we have chronic electricity shortages around the country, and particularly in California and Texas, it's been a debacle.
Yeah, for sure. Now, are you focused primarily right now on domestic policy?
Yeah, I mean, I am. So my focus is on policy for sure. I'm trying to create something. I mean, I'm working on something I call the Energy Freedom Platform, and it has 5 key aspects to it. So it's liberating domestic development, ending preferences for unreliable electricity, reforming air and water emission standards to incorporate proper cost-benefit analysis, liberating nuclear, decriminalizing nuclear, and then addressing CO2 emissions long-term via liberating innovation, not punishing America. And for most of these, there's a lot of work to be done in each area, because I'm working on developing the policy with enough specificity that it can actually be the basis of legislation. So in some states, I'm working with people on it and with some congressional offices. And then if we have it, I don't align really with either party in terms of my overall beliefs, but in practice, if there's a Republican president, I think I'll have a real chance of convincing them to adopt a lot of these policies. So that's my main focus. I'm very interested in international stuff. I'm very interested in Canada, actually. I think there's a lot of collaboration with Canada that's interesting. And I'm very interested in energy poverty. And in particular, I'm probably making the most headway in Africa. I'm going to Africa Energy Week. I'm actually leaving in 2 days to head over to Cape Town. And I'm hoping to make a splash there. I'm one of the keynotes at Africa Energy Week. And I think I've had some influence already on African leaders standing up to some of the unfair international stuff, but I'm trying to have a lot more. And part of that is figuring out positive policy solutions. The next phase of my career is really coming up with positive policy solutions that legislators can use. So far, my career, I think it's been very valuable, but it's been more about how to think about these things and what your general perspective should be. But now I'm really interested in what are the concrete policies that will actually make nuclear succeed? What are the concrete policies that will actually allow geothermal to succeed? How can we actually take advantage of fossil fuel resources I think we should be taking advantage of? And that's a lot of very detailed work, but I like it. And I think it's the important thing for me to do versus just spend the next 10 years becoming more and more famous as kind of, as an energy advocate and a fossil fuel advocate. I hope I do, but it's mainly because the fame is useful in influencing policy.
Yeah. Are you worried sometimes that you're sort of the bullet point aspects of some of your messaging make it feel like you're not constructive? Fossil future. Let's talk about Africa for a second, because I did generate this slide. This is, I think, you're making this point about fossil production. We need a highly energized and fossil powered future. And Nigeria has had an amazing boom in its resource. Shell and other companies did horrible things in extracting that resource. Most of the benefit has not gone to Nigerians. Nigeria currently has one of the highest rates of energy poverty in the world. I wrote about clean cooking, biomass cooking, and there's more of that in Nigeria than just about any other country around, even though it's had this. It's a member of OPEC. So where's who flourishes in this world is really a big question, right?
If only it were having fossil fuel resources in the ground made you flourish, or even having them extracted in your country made you. I mean, that's definitely not true, right? Because just on the face of it, theoretically, people could, I don't think this is the full story of what's happened at all, but people could just steal it I mean, they could just steal. So that wouldn't. So I think what the point is, if you look at every country that has developed and prospered, whether or not they have domestic fossil fuel resources, they've used fossil fuels to develop and prosper. And this is, in fact, I'm bringing out some, I'll talk about the talking points, but people follow alexepstein.substack.com. This week's talking point is going to be about African energy. And this is one thing that's come up when I speak in Africa. Well, what about these countries that don't seem to have benefited? But if you look at, for example, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, these are places with little to no fossil fuel resources, and yet they've developed and prospered overwhelmingly with fossil fuels. Singapore, something like 95% fossil fuel use, and
Sure.
an amazing prosperity story. So what you need, fossil fuels are at this point in history, are a necessary, like an indispensable, but not sufficient condition of flourishing. And this is something that I didn't emphasize enough in Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. I emphasize it much more explicitly in Fossil Future. And it's that without political reform, including political freedom, including respecting rights and preventing certain kinds of corruptions and having an environment where businesses can do business and it's actually constructive and not exploitative. Without that, you can't really harness the potential of any industry, including fossil fuels. So I think the key is it's not enough to, you can say categorically, it's absolutely wrong to restrict, say, the ability of Nigerians to use fossil fuels. Or I was just in Uganda for my honeymoon. I mean, they're excited about a pipeline there. I think it's categorically wrong to discourage them from doing that. But that's not the only, that doesn't solve everything. It prevents a definitive problem, but it doesn't solve everything. And this is why more and more I'm interested in policy, because it's not enough to just say, hey, fossil fuels are good, don't eliminate them. It's how do we help how do we help everyone, including other countries? And so my research on other countries is a little bit earlier in terms of knowing exactly what to do, because you get involved in, well, just how do you have political reform? And that's something I'm learning about. I mean, a person I admire a lot, we've started talking a little bit recently, is Magat Wade. I don't know if you know her, from Senegalese entrepreneur, successful entrepreneur, she was on Jordan Peterson's show and Lex Friedman's show, and she's talked positively about fossil fuels. She's doing a lot of exciting work to have pro-freedom policies in Africa. And she and I definitely agree on just there's this unbelievable potential in Africa. There's so much ambition right now. People want so much of a better life, but you need, to use a word that offends a lot of people, capitalism, or some variant of capitalism. And that's what she's working to do. And I'm interested in working with people like that. But I have to admit, I'm still earlier on that. I just don't know as much about that as I do the steps to fix things in the US. And in the US, we have the advantage of, we have a lot of problems, and it's not full capitalism as I would advocate, but it's at least an environment where you can do business and you don't have all kinds of corruption, and you have some kinds of contracts and property rights. And in a lot of poor places, you don't have that, and it's no accident. That's why they're poor.
Yeah, but that gets back to Nigeria as just one example of.
Right. So it's an example of it's not a sufficient condition to have fossil fuels in your area, or even to have fossil fuel extraction. But I think it is a necessary condition to have fossil fuel use, and having fossil fuel extraction can be tremendously beneficial. It can also, though, we've seen with many examples, it can also, in some ways, if you have corrupt governments or problematic governments, I don't say it makes it overall worse, but it certainly can institutionalize some really bad forces, which we've seen in the Middle East, that's a whole interesting history of what was done in terms of a lot of dictatorships breaking agreements, what they called concessions for oil development, and sort of nationalizing these things. And you just institutionalize people who are in many, many ways bad actors. And then you have a whole system where they often just take actions that are very harmful to their people, including continuing to suppress freedom. And their oil wealth helps with that.
Yeah.
And so that's really bad. But the fact that those abuses exist doesn't mean we shouldn't use the stuff well.
Right. And that does lead to some tough challenge. That makes it more of a systemic and complicated path forward. this is a valuable part of your argument. I hope it does get through in how people interpret your book and your website and the like.
One quick thing about I'll just say very quickly about talking points, because I do have this, it's a little weird. I have a site called energytalkingpoints.com.
Yeah.
And the talking point has an association with superficiality or narrative and that kind of thing. But if you look at how I do talking points, if you just search something like subsidies on energytalkingpoints.com, you'll see I have an argument against this idea that fossil fuels are disproportionately subsidized, and it's something like 70 points long. But the points have references. Oh, great. Yeah, pull it up. The points have references and they're integrated. So a lot of it is, if you just pull, like, you do the every net zero one as an example, or you can do the Maui one. The Maui one is an interesting example. The wildfire, you can see that there. So you can see it's a serious analysis of the situation. And our analysis came out a lot later than other people's because a lot of people were making claims that we just didn't have the evidence for. And by the way, many people on, quote, my side of things often make very inaccurate claims. And one thing I try to do is I have an amazing research team, including one guy in particular, Stefan Henna, and we're really, really careful. So I think these things are well researched, but they're also, if you read them through, it's like a long essay. But the reason I divide it into talking points is because I want it to be as usable as possible for allies. And many elected officials, I work with a lot of elected officials now, they can't just use a white paper directly. So if I just give them the white paper, they're not going to read it. They're not going to be able to parse it properly. So what I do is I make all the talking points self-contained and accurate so that you can use any of them out of context. They're better if they're in the full context, but any of them can be used out of context. And I think that's a good thing. And one of the things we've seen is we've started to see presidential candidates using the fact about the 98% decline in climate-related disaster deaths.
Whoops. Actually, I wanted
to do that.
Hold on. We got things got frozen there for a second. Okay. You said, yeah, I think I saw that. To talk a little bit more about that one.
Well, I was just saying, it's like, I think it's a good thing. I think this is an argument that for years, nobody was hearing. Nobody was refuting it, but nobody was hearing it. And now people are hearing it, and they're hearing it. I would argue a lot of what's coming from presidential candidates and politicians is more accurate. At least the ones who are using energy talking points is more accurate than it used to be. That's not to say, I don't endorse any politicians, and I'm certainly not going to endorse categorically everything any candidate says. But I've generally seen, from my perspective, an improvement. So I think energy talking points has been a good force. And I will say the next level of it, if people subscribe, you'll see this in a week or two. We have Alex GPT, or it'll soon be called Alex AI. You can actually download it from the App Store. But it's, and I'll send you, Andy, I'll send you a free copy so you can check it out. But this is actually me. This is actually a chatbot we've invested a lot of time and money into that I think is very accurate answers from my perspective to all energy, environmental, and climate questions. And I try to combine very high rigor and very high usability. I do think those can go together.
Let's go back to the disaster point. This is something I've written extensively about. And
okay,
you have made a fairly straightforward argument that fossil fuels are abundant, and their abundance and the flourishing that has occurred the last 150 years has made us much safer. And that's when you get that statistic. But what about, let's just look at Bangladesh. Their reduction in deaths in Bangladesh has nothing to do with fossil fuels. It's a country that actually still doesn't have enough energy, but their death rate went down 100-fold just since I bought the Concert for Bangladesh Beatles album in 1972. Those cyclones don't have any impact now that they do. Now the deaths, every death is lamentable, but they're measured in the hundreds.
What's your explanation? You say it has nothing to do with fossil fuels.
It has to do with communication. It has to do with education. It has to do with some very low tech innovations in. It also has to do with one other thing here. Oh gosh, here, weather forecasting. All those satellites were launched with rocket fuel it's not fossil fuels. Satellites mostly run on various forms of power that are not fossil fueled. So combine that with the high-tech stuff, with this reality, and the reality on the ground is very straightforward. And this is not just in Bangladesh. So to make the argument, well, fossil fuels are the reason the world is safer.
Well, I say that they're a leading factor, and so we can
dominant. I think you use the word dominant.
Yeah, I would think dominant. So if we let's look at
Bangladesh, is a low energy country. I think it needs to have much more, but it's completely transformed its relationship with cyclones.
So let's 2 points about this. So one is we have to look at where were the deaths coming from. So if there's a 98% decline, where are the deaths coming from? And the biggest source of deaths has been drought. And that is very related to things like fossil fuel irrigation and fossil fuel crop transport. So there's a whole category of things of forms of climate protection or climate mastery, as I call it, that are like you can see direct use of fossil fuels. You power a heating machine, you power an air conditioning machine, you power an irrigation system, you power a ship that transports crops, you power machines that build sturdy buildings and infrastructure and that kind of thing. So that's one category of benefit, and it's a very large category of benefit. But another category of benefit I talk about is the freeing up of human time made possible by fossil fuels taking care of the basic necessities. So if you want to talk about, weather forecasting systems and that kind of thing, that specialization and that innovation is made possible by a fossil fueled economy that freed up all of that time. And this is a big argument I make in chapter 4 of Fossil Futures. I think when you're looking at fossil fuels benefits, you have to look at what are the benefits of using the energy directly, what are the benefits of the time freed up, and then with fossil fuels, this is specific to fossil fuels, is what about all of the cost-effective materials that we use in all of these different domains. And so to look at Bangladesh, I think there's at least a lot of the time freed up, and then you mentioned the satellites, which I addressed. So it's not the only thing, but it is a dominant factor, particularly if you think of how it's freed up the time. If you look at what happened when Vivek, you did not do this to my knowledge, but when you look at when Vivek made the point about 98% decline, it was really revealing of what I call the mainstream knowledge system, because immediately everyone came out with this, not you, but like PolitiFact and New York Times, everyone came out with this point that, oh no, there have been 2 million disaster deaths or extreme weather deaths since 1970, made worse by climate change. That's the way they put it. But then if you just think about that for a second, that means 40,000 deaths a year, which is way fewer than used to exist. And then Vivek pointed this out, and then the response was, oh, well, it's just storm warning systems. And they didn't even look at the data. They didn't even look at the data about drought. They just said that, and they didn't realize, wait, storm warning systems plus evacuation, those have a lot to do with fossil fuels. I do think that you want to be as precise as you can about interrelationship among these things, but fossil fuels are an enormous factor, and they're a factor that is being denied at the highest levels. The IPCC does not talk about fossil fueled climate mastery. They don't acknowledge the decline in climate disaster deaths. This is a systemic problem to not talk about how can you be a climate reporting agency and not talk about the state of disaster deaths? That's not an accident, and that's putting narrative above reality.
For sure. And I think this has happened a lot. I think it does need to be called out. I'm glad you're doing it. I've been doing a lot of this myself. And it comes down to, I think one thing I think we could agree on, let's see, is if you change these discussions more to climate risk, if the word risk is not used enough, the thing we don't want to live with, right, is risk in human society. The thing we do want to have is opportunity.
Less of it relative to reward. We certainly need to live with
right. And risk is a function of hazard, meaning fire, flood, etc., exposure, and vulnerability. And vulnerability is a function of poverty largely. So reducing poverty, including through what's happened with fossil fuels historically, globally, on average, is important. But if you start to dig in on this at the regional scale, which is where risk reduction mostly happens, it's not about fossil fuels. It's about systems for identifying and reducing the vulnerability of those who are marginalized, don't have a voice, and are living in with threats. That's in poor countries. And in rich countries, something has to be done about zoning or building codes that can change the outcomes in places that are fundamentally vulnerable to some of these hazards, with or without climate change. And you don't really kind of get into that, I think, as far as I've seen. You're focused about the energy focus is important. Making it sort of carbonist, it almost falls into the trap of distracting the way those who focus too much on the climate side of the carbon problem, I think, distract from.
Well, because
reality.
I do think that it's that there's a pervasive myth that fossil fuels are rapidly replaceable. If that myth wasn't there, then I would
Sure.
just focus more on the energy. And I do think that when you're talking about different categories of risk, there's a question of how much climate related risk, how much that should be a focus versus other things. I mean, we have a lot of biological risk that's, I think, long scared me before COVID. And then COVID is an example of why it should be scary. And I think people have drawn all the wrong lessons from COVID. That's another, on both sides, on all political sides, I think have drawn the wrong kinds of lessons from COVID. But insofar as you're thinking about, climate related risk, I do agree with taking a nuanced approach and looking at what are all the elements. And it's true that Fossil Future is not a comprehensive guide to how to do that. For instance, I don't have a lot in Fossil Future, just even about how do you have better policies that allow you to evolve and adapt over time, or even like what's the best policy towards seawalls. And the main thing is because I'm just, and I do have more time, by the way. The main thing is just because every book has to have a subject. And for me, the subject is what to do about the world's massive use of fossil fuels. And the most popular political idea in the world is it should be rapidly eliminated. So I'm focused on that. But I do agree that it's crucial, if you're working on the policy, to work on these details. And I would say on the other side of things, when people, and you're criticizing this, and I'm glad you are, when people just say, oh, climate policy is just reducing emissions, that is really disingenuous, especially because, as I've pointed out recently, you still, and net zero as an idea acknowledges this, your emissions are still aggregating until you get to net zero. CO2 takes a while to leave the atmosphere. So whatever you think about CO2's effects, aggregating CO2 is going to be with us for a while. And so if you're just using, if your solution to everything is let's attack fossil fuels in this particular region, you're not even dealing with the effects that are happening. And then the question is, well, what do you really care about? Are you just looking for, are you just looking to make fossil fuels a whipping boy, or do you actually want to keep people safe from climate danger?
For sure. And we agree. I think we agree enthusiastically on some of those points. And let's show you. This gets to me. Yeah, like we agree. I think if energy sources are not the enemy, impacts are the enemy, theoretically.
Well, I mean, I would very strongly emphasize negative impacts, because impact, I'm at war with the idea that impact is bad. I mean, there's a deep premise that human impact on nature is bad as such, as in, I put it as it's intrinsically immoral. That's the view. I think this is a pervasive idea. The roots of it are interesting, but it's a pervasive idea. And I do think it's ultimately an anti-human idea. So that you just need to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy impacts, or positive and negative impacts. But then that's also going to relate to the issue of your standard. Are you measuring it by the world? Like, are we trying to advance human flourishing on Earth, or are we trying to eliminate human impact on Earth? And if your goal and standard is to eliminate human impact on Earth, then you just see civilization as a catastrophe. And I do think a lot of the leadership sees it that way. And I think it helps explain why the hostility toward nuclear, why the hostility toward hydro, why the hostility toward mining, even for solar and wind, because impact is the enemy. And CO2 is an impact that can scare people and get them to oppose modern life as such. This is not true by any means everyone, but I do think there are real leaders who are, and I talk about this in chapter 3, who are just hostile to human impact as such. And for them, CO2 is not the issue. It's just it's just one of many impacts that they hate.
I think you're right. There is a certain element of that out there for sure. A couple more things I wanted to throw by you.
By the way, did we get any audience questions? I mean, your questions are great, so I'm happy to answer
We
that.
haven't actually. It's hard. People in the middle of the day, it's hard to break away from what they're doing. This show ends up archived and right away, and I'll be putting it on Substack, and you could do the same thing with the videos, and we can generate a lot more discussion with some of this.
Okay. Very well. Yeah, no, keep it coming then. I just want to make sure we weren't getting anything interesting. I didn't want to.
It was just that practical question. Naomi Braff had asked, "Are these on your Substack?" And but I posted the link to Energy Talking Points as well. So
yeah,
that's all there. This has come up. I'm going to throw a couple of things here that actually support your point of view. To a certain extent. I did a conversation a year or so ago on carbon takeback, the idea of a carbon takeback obligation on fossil companies that have historically grown influential. I have lots of issues with that general idea, but there was a point in this discussion about Africa that I think really resonates with some of your points as well. Miles Allen is a longtime IPCC author. He was on here with couple of people who used to be at big fossil companies, but just listen to what is said here.
Technology. But we also need policy and approaches that understand the importance of energy security on the continent and do not reduce that and for the sake of green industrialization. Thank you.
These are such important points you're making.
And if I may just say that I think Vincent was being very polite, saying it was impractical for rich countries to tell African countries to not touch their fossil fuels.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of a country like Britain that has announced its intention to wring every last drop of oil out of the North Sea, to turn around to Ghana and say, no, we're not going to lend you any money to develop your fossil fuel reserves because they should stay in the ground. That, for me, is utterly outrageous. We should be working out how we can help Africa exploit her fossil fuel resources, her God-given, as you put it, fossil fuel resources, Vincent, without causing global warming. And of course, carbon takeback is the way to do that.
Now, he's making the point about who should invest to compensate for the emissions that would happen. But that's a separate question. And you, I also talked to Johan Rockstrom. He's like at the far end of the spectrum of boundaries, science, and the like.
Mm-hmm.
And he made this point about justice as well, in a way that I found profound. At COP26 in Glasgow, he said something unbelievably aligned on the ethical side with what you were talking about, although he definitely interprets it differently because he's all about the 1.5 degree concept. But let me it's a really quick little thing.
Yeah, sure.
And then you could react to these two. That'd be good. So he said this at COP26.
Must be just, and this justice factor has very dramatic numbers. We know them all, but just to give you the latest statistics, the richest 1% must reduce emissions by a factor 30, while the poorest 50% in the world can actually increase emissions by a factor 3 for the world to stay within the global carbon budget in a fair way.
So obviously he's painting this all in the context of the carbon budget, remain south of 1.5 C. But his argument is all based on the fact that 50% of the world is under-energized and should have the ethical right to have that carbon space. So is there like wiggle room here, or is that 1.5 degrees thing, is the construct that is in his head too far away from you to think about having a conversation?
Well, I can think about it. I mean, I'd be happy to have a conversation, and I don't think anyone has ever offered me to have a conversation who disagrees with me that had any prominence at all in any audience that I would refuse to have a conversation. But you mentioned the construct. Yeah, he's thinking about it as the number one thing on our mind should be eliminating our climate impact as quickly as possible. And I think that's just not compatible with advancing human flourishing as much as possible, given what I've talked about with the economics of fossil fuels and how crucial they are and how they help us master climate. I just don't think CO2 levels matter nearly as much for the foreseeable future as the availability of energy, and the world is desperately poor. And so what I am glad to see is some people now waking up to the obvious reality that it's immoral to tell people who have virtually no energy and to focus on them as the target. And they have really been the target. And the reason is important because it's always easier to stop new things than to dismantle existing things. So when people are saying, hey, even for hydro, don't build this dam in some African nation, or like, don't build this pipeline, or this even happened in the past. This is a whole other story with DDT. Like, hey, don't use DDT. We use DDT, but you can't use DDT. It's always easier to stop new things. This is part of why nuclear has not advanced more, because the green movement really arose near the beginning of nuclear. And so they were able to shut it down a lot. Whereas if nuclear had evolved, if it had all gotten started 30 years earlier, I think we might have a nuclear world right now, because it would just be established. And once it's established, it's hard to stop. So I'm glad people are standing up against the obvious injustice of focusing on the poorest nations and trying to reduce their meager fossil fuel use. Nevertheless, telling the rich world to cut their emissions by 30, that is just, for the reasons I've given, in my opinion, just profoundly destructive to the rich world and to the poor world. We have to recognize the poor world has gotten a lot richer and a lot better off and a lot less vulnerable, in large part due to advances by the rich world. The whole world is interconnected in many positive ways and negative ways. If you make our energy unbelievably expensive and scarce, that is not going to be to the benefit of anyone. So I'm glad people are starting to worry about energy poverty, but the idea that we should radically reduce our energy production and use, which is what in practice fossil fuel restrictions on that timetable will mean, I mean, you're going to ruin these countries. They're going to regress dramatically, even if they use a little bit more energy.
Yeah. You brought up the unreasonableness of the 30-fold reduction in CO2. And I see that as absurd as well, just given the basic geophysical and development realities the world faces. But how are you casting the climate problem in your own head is, I think, an important question. How there is an argument for really seriously doing much more for the sake of risk management on a sort of abetting either decarbonization or carbon withdrawal, which to me, again, is the scale of that is kind of so off the charts, it doesn't feel reasonable. It's why I think I differ with you to a certain extent to a significant extent on what we need to invest, whether it's in innovation, whether it's in policy, to drive forward post-carbon options. And just
do you want to play the
starting point?
This video is somehow related, which I'm curious how it's related.
But do you know Will Happer?
I do.
Yeah, I interviewed him when he was being considered for the science advisor position.
Did you want me to? I don't know if
you really do see it as a non-problem, not as something worth investing in.
Absolutely. I think not only a non-problem, I see the CO2 as good. Let me be clear. I don't think it's a problem at all. I think it's a good thing.
He went on to describe.
I'm all for climate science. If I were king, I would maintain and improve if I could. Any measurement systems we have, satellites, ocean buoys. I think those are wonderful things. And, one of our problems, say, in climate is that, there you need long-term good science, for example, long-term temperature records, long-term records of CO2. And it's very hard, for the government to support that kind of stuff.
So we were totally in tune on the idea that we're underinvested in monitoring and understanding the system. But what he said about CO2 to me was so off the scale, it was kind of amazing.
Well,
what's your take?
So my view is my number one view about this, and I just want to say this quickly again, is the standard. It's like when we're looking at the state of the earth and the climate, we need to really make sure what our standard is, and mine is advancing human flourishing. So part of that I mentioned is I look at the benefits of fossil fuels, the climate mastery benefits, but also I try to be even-handed and precise about benefits and challenges or harms from CO2. And I really think it's important to be open to both. And this idea we have that impact is bad can make it absurd that more CO2 could be more beneficial. I think it's plausible that more CO2 on its own, and it's never on its own because it comes with energy, but could be net beneficial. I actually don't think anyone really knows. And I think one of the big handicaps we have, besides it's just hard to predict a lot of things, is a lot of climate scientists aren't operating on a human flourishing standard. They're too often operating on the idea that impact is bad. I'm very open to the idea that more CO2 is net negative. So I don't know, and I say this explicitly in Fossil Future. I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody knows, but I do think I agree with more instruments and stuff, but I think we actually need clearer philosophy and not just assuming, like when we just talk about climate change as bad, that's just a view that, okay, it means human climate change, so it means impact is bad. So I want to see better science. Because I don't know, I think it's important to be open to the hypothetical of warming faster than I might expect. And I talk about different scenarios in chapter 9. I think that if you had problematic warming, or warming that was significantly net negative that you'd want to do something about, the thing you would absolutely do, and people don't want to talk about this, but you would absolutely deliberately cool the climate.
Right.
That's just, there's nothing that resembles that in terms of cost effectiveness, including Bjorn Lomborg has made this point, and not that he endorses it outright or now, nor do I, but just we know ways to warm the earth and cool the earth. We will get more and more sophisticated. If we have a warming problem, trying to rapidly convert the whole world to energy solutions that we don't have, and when the world needs far more energy, the world is much more going to embrace, hey, let's try to approximate some of what happens when a volcano cools the earth without any other hazards. And we can figure that out at some point. So I think the next level of climate mastery, actually whether warming is a problem or not, is going to be macro climate mastery. If people think that in 100 years, nobody's going to be changing the global climate deliberately, I think you're delusional. I mean, I live in Laguna Beach, which I think is just about the nicest place in the world. When I visited Austin a couple of weeks ago, it's too hot there. And it's not too hot just because, it's warmed a degree Celsius. It's too hot just because most human beings don't like the weather most times in most places. We're going to figure out how to change that. That's just going to happen. So I think we should be exploring not just climate measurement, but climate mastery in the name of advancing human flourishing on Earth. The climate we're given is not perfect, but also you can't. I mean, Will knows a lot more about specifics than I do, but I'm certainly not in a position to say, oh yeah, more CO2 is just a categorical good. I mean, there's obvious kinds of things. I mean, there's a question of how much, what's the warming effect, and he's at the lower end of thinking, he thinks we've saturated it in various ways. And again, I'm not in a position to say whether he's right or where others are right, but insofar as it causes warming, leads to sea level rises, that's pretty uncontroversial. Well, there are at least challenges with those. There's at least going to be some increase in heat waves with more warming, although it's more concentrated in cold places. So I think one needs to be very methodologically pro-human and very methodologically even-handed, and then methodologically objective about what we don't know and know. But I do think the path forward is going to be, I think the world is going to do in one form or the other what I advocate, but much less consistently. I mean, we're going to use a lot of fossil fuels. Hopefully we'll liberate alternatives, which is a lot of what I'm working on. And insofar as we have challenges with CO2, or even not, which I think not is more likely, but we're going to master the climate at a macro level. And that's going to be a really interesting discussion of how to do that, and how different people's rights and interests intersect. But I think that's what's going to happen.
There's so much more to explore. The one thing I wanted to throw by you as a closing thought, and then maybe we can do something more. I've been not in my best mode today, so there's lots of things going on in my life that are making
Okay,
No,
I'm
it's
sorry.
all good. It's all good. It's just
Uh,
not my
you seem
best
fine. You
conversation.
seem fine to me, but maybe you're going to get killed by the internet saying like, why didn't you attack
No,
Honest?
no. Well,
So you can invite me back and attack me more next time.
no. I've talked to a bunch of researchers. They're mostly at this place in Austria called IIASA, IIASA, the International Institute for Applied System Analysis. Nakavenovic, who's one of the earliest IPCC authors, he and others have charted the long-term organic decarbonization of the global energy system. And I was going to show a slide, but my PowerPoint is locked up in some way. And essentially, it's this very smooth curve. It's gone on for a couple hundred years of a steady decarbonization of our energy system, including all these.
I assume it's on a percent. It's got to be on a percentage level, not on a.
Yeah, but what you see is it's not a function of much at all. It's not a function of policy. It's not a function of anything you write or a function of anything I say or have written.
I would love.
It's kind of like.
To see it.
So I think in a way the question is: are we all just bloviating about something that's just sort of is our relationship with energy so fundamental and sort of beyond conscious management in the sense that there are so many things at play that we're all bloviating?
No. I mean, it's always worth considering, though. I think it's a good thing to consider when you're talking a lot. Is it doing anything? But I think what I would point to, there's a book I like a lot called "Where's My Flying Car" by this guy J. Storrs Hall. And one stat that he makes a lot of, which I think is important, is just the flattening of energy use. How progress for a long time was involving increasing energy use fairly steadily, and starting in the 70s, it really starts to level off. And he thinks that leads to quite a bit of lost potential, which I agree with as well. But I think it shows how policy can have a huge impact. And in particular, I think nuclear policy has had a huge impact in terms of cutting off. Again, I mentioned it's easier for policy to stop new stuff than to get rid of old stuff. So
yeah, for sure.
So if you look at it as decarbonization, let me try to view this bigger on my screen.
So this is carbon intensity of primary energy consumption over time since 1850. And the thing that's impressive to me is just the paper. This is a paper from a long time ago, but I've been in touch with them recently about whether there's data that cut in a different direction. And essentially, as it says here, decarbonization appears as a continuous and persistent trend throughout the world, albeit occurring at a very slow rate of about 0.3% a year. And it just is what it is.
I'd be really interested in looking into if we talk next time, I can look into the details. So is there anything, just how much, if any of it, is just more efficiency in harnessing energy from hydrocarbons? Because if you just look at how much more energy we get from coal now than we did 100 years ago.
Yeah, this kind of integrates across those factors. At any rate, I mean, I think the bigger point is just that, is this part of the human journey that is not really amenable to policy?
No, but we're seeing, I mean, you look at just different shortages that we have. You look at electricity problems that we have. There are the macro forces of what's cost effective and what the technology development, like things that are inherent in the physical potential of different forms of energy and efficiency increasing over time. There's a lot of interesting stuff there that probably informs some of these trends. So it's not all or nothing, but I just see policy affecting so much of the stuff we've talked about. Again, the development of nuclear energy, retarding poor countries' ability to advance, harming electricity, contributing to the current global energy crisis. We didn't talk much about that, but I think policy has been really bad there. Even empowering certain dictators, which I think wrong international policy toward us. So even though there are it's not just those of us who talk about policy that influence things, and those who make policy, it matters a lot. So that's why I think it's valuable to have these kinds of discussions.
Well, the more we can have this kind of discussion, that and not in a sense of a win-lose debate, the better. I think whether it's with, you've debated Dessler and McKibben and others, and
you were the first one, that's, I'll always be grateful, because you gave fair coverage of my debate with McKibben. And I thought, oh my gosh, a guy from the New York Times didn't just say, like, climate denier Epstein is an idiot. Like, you actually encouraged people to watch it. So that was that was 11 years ago now. That was
I have to look back to see what I said at the time. I can't even remember.
I think you just said something like, you didn't say much about, you just encouraged people to watch it and said, different people have different opinions on how it went. So, but I just remember that, oh yeah, this is, I think you always want people, kind of the most interesting thing I find is that often the best thing is to see disagreements or discussions among people you think are thoughtful from different sides. I try to find, with any position, I want to know who's the best advocate of it, not who's the idiot. So I think it's I mean, we definitely haven't covered the full spectrum of opinions, because there are a lot of people, particularly on your side of things, who are much more, much more climate catastrophist. We got to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels. But I do hope that, particularly people who are interested in your work, that I want them to just think about kind of, what's my method, what's my standard, and maybe this crazy Epstein guy who does talking points and writes books with provocative titles, maybe he has some points.
Yeah, the challenge is ultimately in how these arguments get utilized in the policy sphere. I was on Lex Fridman's show with Lomborg, and we spoke for 4 hours, and we had a lot of agreement, and some points where we disagreed. One of which I talked to Bjorn about, how his arguments end up getting sort of caricatured and then deployed in ways that don't really reflect his full sense of the importance of sustainability, for example. And and I don't know of an easy way around that. You testify at hearings, and you're utilized as a tool for some very simple things, and the nuance gets lost. Does that worry you sometimes, that you're kind of doing something that's, and I talk about carbonism. There are a lot of people at the other end of the spectrum who are carbon centric. You know what I mean? And I think in a way you're carbon centric too, as opposed to looking at the full dimensions of what would prompt flourishing, as I said earlier, in Nigeria, or in a poor neighborhood in Pittsburgh.
Well, no, for reasons I've gone into, I wouldn't agree with that as a characterization, except I'm focused on energy. I mean, I'm energy centric. And for the reasons I gave about the unique cost effectiveness of carbon-based energy for the foreseeable future, that makes me carbon centric. I guess I try to present everything in a way that it's hard to distort. I find that when people use my messages, it's usually not them using my message that's the problem. It's when they're using other messages that's the problem. Somebody will use a point of mine, and then they'll say something, oh, that's not right. So I'm just trying to, I try to just do everything one reason to do talking points is I want to use exact wording for everything, and at least give them the option of using the exact wording, using the references. So I would like it all to be used 100 times more, and I think that would generally be for the good. And I would like to see more Democrat. I mean, I'm trying to engage. I go to DC every 2 months. So any Democrat politicians watching this, I mean, I occasionally talk to them, but it's hard to get them to talk to me. And I would like to. I try to talk to everyone about this, because I don't do any, lobbying, fundraising, endorsements. All I do with politicians is just interact with them directly on messaging and policy. And I think we need people of both parties to think a lot more rationally about this issue.
I do too. And I do like maybe we'll close on the idea of using language and then supporting it. In a way, you've created an interesting hybrid of the bullet point and the background all being in sort of a bite-sized initial entity, and then kind of with a backing that can come through It's not called a tweet anymore, right? A post.
Well, and I still call it a tweet. And look, I put it all out there. I mean, everything I tell, almost everything I tell politicians in the background is just public. So I just try to be totally transparent. Hey, this is what I think. It's not like I'm, you see all these groups circulating talking points like, hey, here's what you should see in the background. I just say exactly what I think people should say. And then I give the reasons and I give the data. And I think that's the way to do it. So I'm happy with the progress, and I'm expecting a lot more.
Well, let's talk more. I've been doing a sporadic kind of what I call a watchwords series.
Oh, yeah.
Like when we use a phrase or a word, what does it actually mean? And one of them is net zero. And
that seems to be a big one.
The most basic one is, I mean, these undeveloped, what do we mean by developed and undeveloped? Resilience, unprecedented. I always say as a journalist, the first question you ask when you hear a politician say that hurricane was unprecedented,
Yeah.
Say, since when? And then what's your timeline and your understanding of that? And then when we go forward, how much of that unprecedented thing you're talking about is the loss, the impact of the hurricane versus the hurricane itself?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I'm a fanatic about terminology, so I love those kinds of discussions.
Another one will be, then there are these phrases that come around like forced electrification, which seems to have an unproductive approach. I know what he's talking about, and I'm sure you've dealt with that too. So thank you, Alex Epstein. Again, this is, I think maybe this is an initial conversation. If we can think about ways to move forward, the work you're doing in Africa is really important to me because I've done a lot of webcasts related to that, and there are a lot of people over there who need to be amplified. So stay in touch on what you're doing.
Awesome, man. Thanks for the opportunity. Great to finally talk to you.
Yeah, and we'll do more. This we can do better. I can do better than this. I'm just
well, I liked it, but that's great. If you can do even better. All
right. Thanks again. And this is shareable everywhere. As soon as we're done, you can clip it up and snip it up. And thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Andy.